Thank you so much. And thank you to all the volunteers every time. You guys put on one heck of a show every time I'm here. So let's give them a quick round of applause. They certainly deserve it. All right, our guest today is Mr. John Bagwell. John and I have known each other for a low on 2 or 3 weeks now.
At least.
I was lucky to go to his home and to conduct an oral history interview with him of his entire experiences. Fascinating story, and like Mary said, go to Hometown Heroes. It's a really cool little podcast that I did with John. The interview that I did with him is on our website, the Vietnam Archive out at Texas Tech. That's available there. And usually when we do these sort of things, we do a kind of a full life sort of thing, full tour kind of retrospective sort of thing. But we're going to do this differently today, and it's a kind of a shame, but it's more of a time thing than anything else. John was a Armed Forces Radio Vietnam DJ. Y'all have seen the Adrian Cronauer Good Morning Vietnam. Well, John has a different but somewhat similar story about that, and it's really cool, and you don't get to hear it today. The reason why is because there's something that both John and I thought was probably a little more significant than that. John was in that On K with the first Cav. So if any of y'all were at the first Cav, you may have heard John as a DJ all those years back. But they moved from On K to, John was going to go to Hue to help take over a AFVN radio station that was already in place there. We're going to jazz it up a little bit with a little more rock and roll. And John arrived in late January 1968. I believe it was January 29, 1968. Anyone else know what happens on January 30th, 1968? The Tet Offensive kicks off, right? This national push by the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, and Hue City, of course, is famous or infamous for the fighting that took place there. John was there the day before the fighting started in Hue, and we're going to, instead of focus on the entire tour, 5 days, but it's 5 pretty intense days. So I'm going to turn it over to John, and he's going to tell you about those 5 days in Hue in 1968 during the Tet Offensive.
Well, good morning, Vietnam. I actually had the afternoon shift, and good afternoon Vietnam does not quite have the ring to it as good morning Vietnam. But I was in On K with the first Air Cav, as Kelly said, and talk about luck. I wound up in Hue one day before the Tet Offensive. They sent me down there to open up a radio station. My friend Steve Straub had arrived about a week before I did. And so I arrived in Hue, and Hue is a very, very beautiful city. Up until that time, there hadn't been much war in the city of Hue. The Tet Offensive, by the way, Tet occurred every year. Tet was the Vietnamese New Year, and it was just a time of celebration, and in many years past, there had been a ceasefire, but in 1968, it became a little bit different. As I said, I arrived on the 29th of January, and we were in a radio station in the city of Hue. There was a MACV compound, and we had probably 200 Americans in Hue. They were mostly truck drivers, disc jockeys, cooks. There were 20 Marines to guard the base. Somewhere in the month before, depending on who you talk to, the North Vietnamese brought 20,000 soldiers into the city of Hue through tunnels and coming in. In fact, some reports say it's 30,000. So you can imagine 30,000 against 300, the odds were quite a bit against us. So we arrived, we had checked in, and I remember an interesting thing. When I arrived there, they dropped me off in the middle of Hue, and I'd been in On K, and so I was quite concerned. I said, there's hardly anything here for protection. Should I be worried? And they said, don't worry, nothing ever happens here. And that was my warning. We knew that Tet was going to come, and we were sitting in the house that we had, and there's some slides I've got of the area here, if we can hit to the next slide perhaps. But we were, as I said, the Tet Offensive was all over Vietnam, and just every place was under attack. We weren't expecting Hue to be under attack, but we were. The next slide shows you a little bit about what Hue looked like during that time. A very, very beautiful city, and just within a couple of days, it just became almost a desolate place. But we gathered in the backyard. We were across from the main headquarters, and keep in mind these were 9 of us, and we were disc jockeys. There was one civilian guy with us with NBC. We were in a house, and all of a sudden the fighting starts. We actually were watching fireworks that evening, and we looked out, and it was going to be a great display of fireworks, and then we realized there was more than fireworks going off, Kelly. They were actually firing rounds, and we looked at each other and thought, we're in deep trouble. We had a landline back to the MACV headquarters, and we called in and said, what's going on? And they said, we think we're under attack. I said, okay, that sounds like something we should know. What should we do? And they said, in their infinite wisdom, stay put. We did for 5 days, hiding out at a house. And Kelly, they came for us.
Tell me about how they came for you. You're in this house, it's been shelled, been small arms fire, then eventually they start to shell this place. What goes on inside that house before you decide to move forward?
Well, for 5 days, we just hung out. We lost control back from the landline back to the MACV headquarters. So we had no idea what was going on. Interesting enough, American Forces Radio was still on. We were across the street from our main headquarters, and the generator was still going, and there was electricity in Hue, so the radio station was still on. And what we had was a radio station from Saigon that came into Hue, and then we rebroadcast it. So we were listening to AFN in Saigon, and we were listening to General Westmoreland say, we knew they were coming. To which we looked at each other and thought, if you knew, I wish the heck you'd told us, because we would have gotten out of the way. So after 5 days of just watching, they showed up, and all of a sudden they started shooting at our building and firing rounds into it. And there's a couple of pictures here coming up that will show you what the house looked like that we were in. We were guarding and trying to do our best to fight these guys off, and I was on guard duty. And keep in mind, again, we're disc jockeys, we're TV personnel, engineers. We did have some weapons. We had a grenade launcher, which came in handy. We did have some grenades, and we had weapons, but at one particular time, a Vietnamese young soldier jumped out in front of me, and I was at the window, and I looked out, and he was shaking. He was just shaking as bad as he could, and he shot off at me, and he was shaking so bad that the first round came by my right ear. It was so close, I could hear the bullet go by. The second round came by my left ear, and I could feel the hair on my ears stand up. And I knew that the next bullet was going to probably hit me square in the face. And I shot him, and he fell dead. And we were close enough. There was a wire on our window bars, and we were about as close as here, and I could have stepped forward with my rifle, hit him on the head with my bayonet, and killed him. That's how close we were. And the guy could not hit me because he was shaking so bad. Truth be known, I was shaking pretty bad too, but I did get him. He fell, and you know the military teaches you to kill, but they don't teach you how to feel when you kill somebody. And like so many of y'all, I never killed anybody before. I didn't know what I was supposed to feel, and I just sat there and I kept thinking, this kid is a kid, and he was probably 10, 12 years old. I mean, very, very young. And of course, I'm 19
Right.
myself, so I'm a kid, and I've just killed this kid, and I'm trying to reconcile what does this mean.
All those years later, over 50 years later, have you come to any conclusion? What does it mean? What has it meant to you?
Well, of course, getting shot means quite a bit, but it's hard to still process, and it's hard to still process that we had an enemy, and I killed him. He could have killed me. We were there in the house, and of course, we had to do something to get out. And a civilian was with us, Courtney Niles, who was with NBC News, and we had invited him to stay with us. And all of a sudden, he burst out the front door, and I followed him. I think I have some pictures of the house, if you could show that real quick, the next couple of slides. But we were able to, guess there's some slides, a couple more shots, one more, two more. There we go. That's the house that we were in, and that's the window that I was shooting out. We discovered we had to get out of there. We had to get out of there very quickly, and so Courtney ran out the front door. I ran out the right behind him. I'd watched enough John Wayne movies that I could lay down some fire as I went across. Jumped in, ran into a ravine, and Courtney looked up at me and he says, "Have you been shot?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." He said, "Well, I have." I said, "Okay." He said, "I think I'm going into shock." He said, I need some help. And he was bleeding. Blood was coming out of his leg. In Oklahoma, we would say bleeding like a stuffed hog. Some of you have heard that before. But he was just bleeding like crazy. And of course, one of the things I did was to pull off my belt, put it around that, get a tourniquet going to keep him from bleeding. What you've got to realize is that at the time, I weighed 108 pounds. Look at me. I'm skinny. There's a picture of me in here, a couple of seconds, of what I looked like in Vietnam. 108 pounds. I had a 28-inch waist. There I am. 28-inch waist. Those of you in Vietnam, you know there weren't too many 28-inch fatigues. I had a size 30-inch fatigues on that was being held up by a belt. That belt is now on this gentleman's leg. I've got to get up. I've got to hold my rifle, hold my steel pot. I'm 108 pounds. I've got to hold this guy that's 150 at least. And somehow, Kelly, we've got to get it up the street and around, and I can save him. And I must have had 4 hands at least at that time.
It's incredible. If you've seen a picture of Courtney Niles, and as John will mention here, Courtney Niles doesn't lift throughout this episode. Courtney was about 6'2", probably every bit of 200 pounds. And he was an Army veteran. He was a combat veteran, but he joined NBC as a correspondent. Courtney is going into shock. You've got your belt wrapped around his leg. What's the next step? How do you handle this?
Well, the next step is we pulled around behind the house, and we heard firing going on, and we could see smoke. Courtney gets shot. He falls to the floor. I reach to him. I check his pulse. He's dead. And it occurs to me at that time, and I didn't think enough to pull the belt off his leg and put it back on my waist, so I still had to be pulling up my pants. It occurred to me that I had been in town 5 days at that part. 1 day before it started, and then 5 days while we were head up. I had no idea where we were going. I had no idea where MACV headquarters was. I knew it was about a mile, but I had no idea. So I immediately ran and started up the street. And they're on top of roofs, continually shoot at me. I could hear what was going on back at the base. What I didn't realize and found out later was that the rest of us, there were 9 total. 2 were killed, and then Courtney, and then 5 people were actually taken prisoner of war. So I basically missed being a POW by maybe 5 seconds because I happened to go the other way. So I'm alone now, and I'm walking down the street, and they're shooting at me from on top of buildings. And all of a sudden, I look down at my leg, and I see a hole in the bottom of my boot. And the brain says, "You've been shot." And the brain says, "This hurts." And I said, "Okay." And the way that it happened, Kelly, was as I was running, the bullet came into the back of my foot. It peeled off underneath the boot, didn't break any bones, but it pulls all the skin out, and then it comes out at the end of my boot. So I wasn't losing blood. I could still run. And so I looked up, and there's this Catholic church that was not there 30 seconds before. So I run up to the front of the Catholic church, and I knock on the door, and the Catholic priest comes, a Vietnamese, and I spoke no Vietnamese, basically. I had learned Dung La, which means stop. I thought that would come in handy sometime. But I'm there, and I knocked on the door, and the priest comes, and I said, "Me, American." I started pointing to my name, and of course I was in a uniform. You help me? And he says, "Yeah, sure, come on in." The guy spoke 3 languages, French, English, and Vietnamese, so I was fine.
It's great to go to a sanctuary like that has been happening over the centuries and to be welcomed in. But even this priest had limited patience or serious concerns about your being there. And this takes another strange turn here.
It does. I made a decision at that point that actually saved my life, but then put my life in danger again. I got out of uniform. The priest said, "I've got civilian clothes. If you want to stay here, you're going to have to be in civilian clothes. I can't let you stay in your military uniform because they will come and they will probably want to kill you." And he says, "I think I can make you look like a Vietnamese. You're small." And I thought, okay. And so he had no antibiotics, so I couldn't get treated for my wound, but he had lots of gauze. And so I'm in civilian clothes. He bandages me up with gauze all around my arm, all around my face, so that all you could see was my eyes. So I sat down in the hallway of the church, and there were probably 25 or 30 other South Vietnamese people that were taking refuge. And all of a sudden, the door swings open, and North Vietnamese, regular uniformed North Vietnamese, burst into the church. They have a rifle. They start down the line, and he has a rifle, and he points it right at my nose. And I closed my eyes, and I said, "There's no way he's going to think I'm a Vietnamese." When I opened up my eyes, in about 10 seconds, he was moving down the road. And somehow, he passed me. And I was extremely lucky at that point.
Extremely lucky for sure, but you also mentioned this incident led to something probably a little more profound in terms of the rest of your life and your spiritual life. Can you talk about that?
It did, and then at that point, the Catholic priest said, "I got to get you upstairs somewhere." So he takes me upstairs to the steeple part of the church, and he said, "We'll hide you up here for right now." He did come back and bring me a Coca-Cola that was hot. It was really, really hot. There weren't too many cold Cokes in Vietnam. And then he brought me a little bowl of rice, and I was excited to have something to eat. As I looked down, there were some little black things in there, and they were moving around. I was hungry, protein. And my wife will tell the story that after I got back, it's only been in the last 5 years that I can eat rice, even Mexican rice. I just didn't want to have anything to do with it. But I'm up inside this steeple, and all of a sudden there's a shelling going on, and all the sides of the church start coming down. The church is under attack. I found out later it was the Americans that were blowing the church up. Somebody had thought the North Vietnamese had taken over the church, so they were going to blow the church off the map. As it turned out, after the fighting was all over and I was laying in top of the steeple and all the sides of the wall were gone, I had this time of reflection and to think. And golly, up until then, the adrenaline had been going and I'd been running and I didn't have a lot of time to think. And I'm sitting there thinking, I've now been shot at 5 or 6 times. I've been shot at by the Vietnamese. I've now been shot at by the Americans. And I'm in civilian clothes, so they don't know that I'm an American. What in the world am I going to do? And I had a few minutes to kind of reflect, and all of a sudden, this real peace came over me. I'm a religious person. I had become a Christian when I was a kid. Didn't know all what it meant, but there was this opportunity that came over me, this warm feeling. And I believe God spoke to me. The Holy Spirit spoke to me. And just as real as could be, and said, John, don't worry. There's only 2 things that are going to happen. Number 1, you're going to die, and you're going to meet Jesus. And that's okay because you're a Christian. The other thing is, you're going to make it, and you're going to have one heck of a story to tell. Only 2 things can happen. So I'm sitting there going, okay, well, which one is it going to be? And obviously I made it, but it was just a wonderful, I had this warm feeling. I'm a breakfast eater, and I love breakfast, and it's sort of like warm pancakes with warm syrup and butter. My whole body just got warm, and I realized it didn't make any difference what was going to happen. Whatever was going to happen, and I could move on. I did find out, it's interesting, I joined the VFW chapter in Richardson here about 4 years ago, and I was telling my story, and one of the guys in the chapter looked at me, came up after it, he said, John, I got to tell you something. I said, I'm the guy that called in the strike on the church. He said, we thought that the North Vietnamese had taken the church. He says, I didn't pull the trigger, but I'm the lieutenant that told the guys to do it, and they came back to me and said, it's a church. Are you sure you want to blow it off the map? They said, yes. And I said, well, your guys were not good shots. I made it.
It's incalculable for someone to be able to make that kind of peace with their maker in those kinds of circumstances. And nothing should ever be taken away from that. You still got to get out of that church.
I've got to get out of the church. And by now, the priest is really worried because the North Vietnamese have been there. The Americans are shelling his church. And by the way, a side note, my mother found an article in Newsweek magazine later that a Catholic priest in Vietnam was executed by the North Vietnamese for hiding an American in the church. I'm 99% sure he's the one, and he paid for it with his life for letting me stay there. But he says that night, he said, you see that light over there? That, I believe, is an American military base. And I said, you believe? He said, I think so. I said, you think so? And he said, I think it's American base, but he said, if you'll crawl there, you can get help. So 11 o'clock at night, I leave the church, rice paddy, to crawl to this American military base. And I woke up every dog, every chicken, every duck, everything in that rice paddy, every ox, making all kinds of noise. I figure somebody is going to decide I'm out there. I get about halfway there, and it's 11 o'clock at night, pitch black, February, and an American helicopter flies over and shines a light down. I'm in civilian clothes. I look like a Vietnamese. I'm skinny. There's no way that a helicopter is going to think that this is some American out there. This went on probably 15 minutes. It seemed like 3 hours. And they would move the light, and as they moved the light, I would move a couple of inches, and then they'd come back. Finally, the helicopter buzzed off, and I made it. But I hadn't thought through what was going to happen next, Kelly, because then I wind up at this military base. But I'm in the rice paddy, and they're there, and there's no way they know that I'm here, and I didn't know what to do. I, again, seen enough John Wayne movies and westerns. I found a stick. I wrapped my white shirt, which was anything but white at the time, around the stick, and I tried to surrender, and nothing happened. And so I jumped up and I said, don't shoot, I'm an American, please don't shoot, don't shoot. And they started shooting. And a guy hollers at me and he says, you an American? And I said, you can't tell from my Okie accent? And he says, what are you doing out there? And I said, well, I was with the Armed Forces radio station. He says, I don't believe you. I said, you don't believe I'm Oklahoma? He says, no. He said, I don't believe you with American Forces radio station. He said, they're all prisoner of war or dead. He said, they're all dead. He said, one guy, John Bagwell, we haven't found his body yet, but he's dead. And I said, well, I am John Bagwell. And he said, you don't look well, come on in.
One step after another, of course, and step is quite a word to use in this case. Your foot's injured pretty badly. Tell me about the medical treatment.
Well, at that time, I'd had no medical treatment, and it wasn't a very big wound, but gangrene was setting in. I could look at my leg, and it was turning black all the way up to my kneecap, and it kept getting worse. I'm now in quite a bit of pain. I hadn't been in pain before, but I'm in pain, and of course, the guys there at the Signal Battalion were glad to see me, but they didn't know what to do with me. But there was a MASH unit, you've seen MASH on TV, on the television, about a mile away. And so they called up the MASH unit, and they said, good news, we found Bagwell. He needs some medical attention, y'all come get him. And they said, fighting is going on in a way. We're not gonna come get him, you bring him to us. And they said, fighting is going on in a way, we're not gonna take him, you come get him. 7 o'clock in the morning, it took till 1 o'clock for them to finally decide who was gonna take me to the MASH unit. But they threw me to the back of a Jeep, ran me to the MASH unit, brought me to the MASH unit, and I get, if you watch MASH on TV, I get Major Houlihan. I get Major Houlihan, she's the doctor, and there's two ways to do it. The Army way and the wrong way. And she looks at me and she says, we're gonna have to take your leg off. And I said, really? I said, can I get a second opinion? And she says, you're in the Army, soldier, there is no second opinion. And I said, please don't amputate my leg. And she said, you're in deep trouble. The gangrene's coming up your leg. You're gonna have more problem in your leg. If that gets to your heart, you're gonna die. And she said, we really need to take your leg off. And I said, please, is there anything you can do? And I started telling her my story. I hid out in the church, I did all this stuff. I've been shot at by the Americans, I've been shot at by the Vietnamese. Is there anything you could do? And she picks up a bottle of that purple stuff that your mama used to use on you when you skinned your leg playing bicycle. Mercurochrome. Stuff's 110 proof alcohol. And she pours that on my wound, and I scream bloody murder. I thought they were taking a chainsaw to my leg. It hurt so bad. And she says, does that hurt? And I said, yes. And she said, well, that's good. That means it's killing the infection. So she came back about every 10 minutes and poured more of that on my leg, and eventually you could just see the black on my leg go down, and I was able to keep my leg. So.
Just amazing. This is, yeah, please. Just one adversity after another. And let's remember, he's a pocket version of Adrian Cronauer, folks. This is not someone who was trained for this sort of thing. John, to wrap this up, what has that experience meant to you over all these years? Obviously, you tell the story, you think about it quite a bit. What has it meant to you after all this time?
Well, of course, I've told my story almost immediately when I started coming back, and I know for a lot of my veteran friends, they don't want to talk about Vietnam. I've got a cousin that never talked about it at all. We've exchanged probably 5 words in 50 years about Vietnam, and I understand that. For me, it's been good therapy for me to talk about it, and somehow coming eyeball to eyeball with the possibility of dying has meant a lot to me. I mean, I wake up every morning thankful that I'm alive, and I'm on borrowed time. 55 years ago, I should have died. And so every day is a blessing for me. And, you know, as it happened there, you know, I've got a story to tell, and it's a heck of a story. But I could have been killed, but I wasn't. And it's been a challenge because one of my best friends, Steve Straub, was killed there. He was the other disc jockey that I knew. And when they captured him, they were all going to march him off. And as it turned out, guy pulls a 45, points it at his head, shot him, and said, "That's what's going to happen to any of you guys if you try to escape. Don't do it." And so he was killed. And, you know, I've dealt with that, Kelly, is why did Steve die and I didn't die? You know, why was I lucky enough to survive? And sometimes you have that survivor's guilt of having to deal with that. But it's been a great experience. I would not take anything for it again, but it was a wonderful experience to happen.
Yeah. Well, I think it's every time you tell the story, dedicate it to Steve Straub.
Yes.
Killed there as he was. And if you ever get a chance to read the story about Det 5 in Hue, it's an amazing, amazing story. Well, let's put an end to this today. John, everyone give John Bagwell a big hand.
Thank you.